is a fellow who is known around the country as a speaker and as a writer and as an activist and as a fellow who slips into various forums by high mucky-muck government officials and jumps up and denounces them and then gets hauled out in front of the campers. And it's a great story every time it happens, which is frequently. And there may be an opportunity coming up soon when George W. Bush speaks here in Richmond in February at the Richmond Forum. I'm not suggesting that anything particular is going to happen, but gee, George W. Bush. David is the author of a number of books that he has here on the weekend, and Daybreak and War is a Lie, and I've read some of them, and he's a terrific writer, he's a terrific speaker. And David, thanks so much for coming down from Charlottesville. David also has a radio program, and I want to thank him. He just offered to let us get on a half an hour and talk about conditions in the Richmond City Jail, which came up at the last conference. So David is going to speak on ending the war.
Thank you, Phil, and thank you to all of you. I've been to a number of these assemblies, and it is always an incredible experience. And I learn a tremendous amount, and I hear a tremendous amount of stories of the most intense injustices and of victories. Phil went through a list of victories upstairs. I don't know if anybody noticed, but those have to sink in because people run away from recognizing when we win victories because we've been beat down so long that we aren't used to it. It's not familiar to us. But back in August and September, something very, very, very unusual happened in this country. The President of the United States said, I want to send some missiles into a country called Syria. And Wall Street said, hell yes. And Raytheon owns the missiles, over $1 million each. Their stock was sky high. The leadership, the misleadership, the so-called leadership of both political parties said, yeah, do it, send those missiles. The corporate television networks, all over it. There was not a debate. These missiles were going into Syria. And they didn't. They didn't. There was an understanding that the United States was jumping into a new war, and it was stopped. And the number one factor, I mean, it was a perfect storm. There were a lot of factors, but the number one factor was public pressure. And people run like mad from that understanding. No, Raytheon didn't want any money that week. No, it was Russia's idea that changed everything. It was the House of Commons in England telling Congress what to do, as if Congress obeyed. It was public pressure above all, and it was global public pressure. And yes, the House of Commons said no to a prime minister on a matter of war for the first time since the surrender down in Yorktown. That was something, and that had an impact. And the Congress members were home on vacation in their districts, going to town hall meetings, getting accused of jumping in a war on the side of Al-Qaeda. And there was understanding in the halls of power that whoever said yes to this risked being another one of those jerks who said yes to Iraq. But that understanding was created by a decade of public pressure and education. This nation wasn't educated to begin turning against war overnight. It happened through dedicated hard work of a decade. But once it happened, once the people said no to a war in Syria, the argument that typically, at an event like this, you could always count on somebody raising their hand in the Q&A period to say, shouldn't we all go home and hide under our beds? What is the point? Why are you bothering? That's gone. They can't say that anymore without being laughed at. We did it. We prevented a war. Now, limited success. We were more against the CIA sending the guns in than we were against the missiles, but that went right ahead. We were in favor, majority of Americans in favor of actual aid, humanitarian aid to the people of Syria. We think, oh, this was just selfishness because there were, people saying it's not worth bombing the Syrians. They won't even be grateful. Look at the Iraqis. They aren't even grateful. We destroyed their country. No, the majority of Americans, this was a serious mainstream argument put into bills in Congress. Walter Jones from North Carolina, not a single Syrian, the entire nation of Syria is not worth the life of a single member of the U.S. military. You had the humanitarian warriors, we must bomb Syrians because they're as good as we are, we can't discriminate, they deserve our bombs. This was a real thing, but the majority of Americans wanted humanitarian aid into Syria in a major way. Not happening. Limited victory, but a victory. A huge promise and potential there. There was a poll done, huge news in the media, even in this country this week. They asked people in 65 countries, what nation is the greatest threat to peace in the world? Anybody have a guess? It was the landslide victory, not even close, overwhelming victory around the world.
Grenada.
The land of the free. The United States of America, across the globe, considered the biggest threat to peace in the world. Would have been even bigger, would have been an even huger margin of victory if the United States hadn't been polled itself. Right? I mean, imagine the nation that openly admits to having troops in 177 countries out of 196, right? So if Syria and Iran are not in that list, they're in a small little category. It means something when you hold off in a couple more countries. The nation that spends, by that $1 trillion calculation, about as much as the rest of the world put together on militarism. The most wars, the most destructive wars, the most troops in other nations, the most drones in the sky, the most weapons in outer space. Imagine this nation seen as the biggest threat to peace. Who could imagine it? But what do you think the United States of America said is the biggest threat to peace on earth? Any guess? Iran, of course, Iran. And Simin was right. In 1981, the nation of Iran did not have a nuclear weapons program. Never has, to this day, had a nuclear weapons program. Well, we have been told that lie for 30 years because in 1981, Iran did have a nuclear energy program. In the 1970s, the United States had supported nuclear energy in Iran under the Shah. When they lost their puppet in the Shah, they turned against Iran, not for any violation of law, not for any environmental destruction by their nuclear energy program. They turned against Iran as a matter of what we call regime change. And we've been told this lie for 30 years with absolutely no basis in fact. And the majority of Americans are convinced that Iran, a nation that spends less than 1% of what the United States spends on its military, a nation that was attacked with chemical weapons with our assistance and refused to fight back with chemical weapons, a nation that has not threatened another nation and not attacked another nation in centuries. This is the biggest threat. This means they can take up and call it down. And we believe it. This is the power of propaganda in this country. The majority of Americans think Iraq benefited from destroying Iraq. A majority of Americans think Iraqis are grateful. The majority of Iraqis say they're worse off. Right? So this is the level of arrogance. The people who live there don't understand that they're better off. We, from above the bombs, we have a better perspective. We have a president who on Tuesdays goes through a list of men, women, and children, picks whom to have murdered, and has them murdered. And we have millions and millions of people in this country who refuse to know that. Front page New York Times story, endless coverage in the media for a week or two, and most people do not want to know that, so they don't know it. This is self-inflicted propaganda. We choose what to become aware of. These weapons, named for Native American peoples who were wiped out, shamelessly carrying on the tradition of U.S. imperialism, are indeed the biggest threat to peace in the world. The drones that are going to make war easy and cheap are taking war into more countries more easily and more cheaply and provoking disasters and crises that then the United States will ride in and pretend it had nothing to do with creating. Polls are very useful things. 75 to 85% of people in this country over and over and over again say our system of government is broken. It's broken. And when you agitate, when you get active, when you fight against the system, what is the number one piece of advice you hear? Work within the system. The system is broken. And when the excuses for war collapse, what is always the fallback, ultimate justification for one of these wars once the weapons weren't there, once every fabrication has been debunked? We need to bring our system of government to other people. The one that we think is broken. We have to kill them so they'll have it. We're not thinking clearly. So we need a movement that will end the institution of war. Not this war, not that war, not this weapon, not that weapon, not this line in the budget. The institution of war. We need to end it. There are things like rape, we don't distinguish the good and the bad. Slavery, we don't distinguish the humanitarian from the non-humanitarian. Child abuse, we don't have Geneva Conventions for the legitimate humanitarian philanthropic types of child abuse. War is the worst thing we have ever invented. We have to stop trying to distinguish the good from the bad, because once you do that, you keep dumping our grandchildren's unearned pay into the possibility that there's going to be a good one. And when you ask people to name a good one, 99% of them go back 70 years to find one. And they're wrong, and we can go into what was wrong with the worst thing that's ever happened on Earth, the Second World War. But that they can't find a justification in the 70 years to follow for our number one public program is rather telling, I think. These wars are one-sided slaughters. They're not on a battlefield. There is no such thing. They're in people's towns, people's villages, people's houses. 99% of the victims are on the other side. You don't hear about them. These are one-sided slaughters. They are the most immoral thing we've come up with, and they make us less safe. They don't protect us. It's not defense. Do not call it defense. Do not say defense spending. Do not say Department of Defense. If you wanted a non-offensive defense system, you could have Border Patrol and Coast Guard and anti-aircraft missiles. You would do away with 95% of what the U.S. spends on its militarism because it has no defensive purpose whatsoever. It's not defensive. Other nations defend themselves with their out-of-date barbaric military thinking for a few percent of what the United States spends under the banner of defense. It is not defense. It endangers us. It is preemptive. It is aggressive. It is illegal. The same thinking that took the Nazis into Poland, the same thinking that took the United States into Iraq, is what justifies putting troops permanently in 177 nations. It's aggressive. It's not defensive. Number one, destroyer of the natural environment. Number one, eroder of our civil liberties. Number one force impoverishing us. Number one location where the funding is for everything good and decent that we might have in the way of education, in the way of health care. We heard stories upstairs. We aren't funding health care for the children of working parents. We aren't funding lawyers for innocent defendants. We aren't funding human needs in Congo. We could save many, many, many times the lives that we are taking away with war for the same dollars. If we took the dollars out of the war machine and put them elsewhere, not only do we get more jobs and better paying jobs, but we save at least 10 times the lives that we avoid taking away with war. So there's no downside to abolishing the institution of war. Next year there will be a global coalition starting up called World Beyond War. And you can get involved early, and you can check out our website that's very much a work in progress, but you want to look at worldbeyondwar.org. Thank you.